Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. As part of the University of Wolverhampton's Black History Month programme, we have brought to you a day of events and are now coming to our final talk of the evening. The next hour will be a discussion about the Windrush Generation Experiences. These are digital interviews currently on display at the Wolverhampton Art Gallery until the 20th of December. Taking part in this evening's discussion will be Delva Campbell, Dr. Richard Hawkins, Dr. Patrick Vernon, and our host, Frank Challenger, who is managing the project. Welcome all. Over to you, Frank.
Oh, right. Thanks very much, Claire. So I don't have to introduce people. Right. What we're talking about is this display at the Art Gallery, which actually represents a project to put online again some 108 interviews that were made at the turn of the century. Now, the idea for this came about because of a project, an event that Delva Campbell was organised. Now, Delva Campbell was at the time, and she was until recently, a qualities officer at the City of Wolverhampton Council. So I'm just going to ask Delva first if she'd like to say something about what that event was about.
Yeah, in October, 17th of October 1988, a group of people in the community came together to mark the 50th anniversary of the Empire Windrush. And that group felt it was important for Wolverhampton that we actually recorded the contributions of Africanians in Wolverhampton. So we got together, formed a Windrush working group for Wolverhampton, organised a big event that was well attended by 4,000 plus people, and the BBC recorded it and they said it was one of the best in Wolverhampton. Now, part of that task was identifying who we needed to give the awards to. And it was interesting because the more we interviewed and spoke to people, they actually said, well, what about so-and-so and so-and-so? So we developed a little book where it explained the contributions and the actual life experiences of those individuals that took part in the actual project we gave the award to. Because the event was so successful, we decided that it'd be good we stay together and really capture those stories and involve a lot more people. And because of that, we linked up with the Lighthouse Media, and this is where Frank came in, because Frank was very, very useful and helpful for us because he actually identified there was some lottery funding from the Awards for All. Is that right, Frank?
Well, it was a special Millennium Festival Fund, it was called. So they were setting up a huge festival to celebrate the millennium, and obviously they wanted a lot of diverse projects. So this kind of fitted quite well into that, I think.
Yeah, so because of that, we got a bigger working group together, put a bid through. We were successful. We linked up with the Wolverhampton Race Equality Council, got involved in other community groups. And we appointed an officer to do the recording of individuals in Wolverhampton. And that's how we got the collection of those who you're going to be listening to in the video, but also the fact that, we were able to actually get that information stored in the archive. So that was quite an experience within itself. And it is important for Wolverhampton that we do record, and which we have, and store the information so that people within schools especially get to acknowledge the contributions of African Caribbeans, which is really lacking in schools.
Right, thanks, Delva. Shall we actually, at this point, shall we have a look at the first of the clips and see what sort of thing people are talking about? Okay, thanks, Claire.
They called us, to help to rebuild the country after the war. We sacrificed and we came here and thought we would have had a good reception, but we didn't get it that way. We have to beseech and beg and do everything to get places to stop. There were places when you go and you knock the door and they look on you, no room for you. They don't want no blacks and they don't want no Irish. Those days, I don't know why. Because the Irish are white people, so I don't know why. However, I didn't moan a lot. I stood my ground and I said, I'm going to stay put and I'm going to work hard and send down my roots and let the indigenous population know that I have stamina in me. I can excel if I want to. So I pick up courage and start to do my thing.
Thanks. I'm wondering now whether, Richard, you could say something about the sort of historical context to this.
Oh, well, after the Second World War, Britain experienced a labour shortage. This was partly because manufacturers across the country were not very willing to invest in new machines, unlike in some continental countries like Germany. So they wanted to continue the way that they had been before the Second World War, which is a kind of labor-intensive approach to doing things. And there were insufficient people to actually supply all the labor. So they were looking for sources of additional labor. And one such source of additional labor was the countries in the Commonwealth, including the Caribbean. And there was the added advantage, of course, that the people from the Caribbean spoke English, which was not a given because some of the countries in continental Europe, when they started to recruit labor from outside their countries, recruited people from countries where English wasn't spoken, or rather German or French or whatever. So, and additionally, of course, the people coming from the Caribbean were very familiar, or at least they thought they were very familiar with the way of life in Britain, because it didn't quite work out that way, because expectations of what life would be like in Britain, as indeed our first speaker in the video clip was saying, it wasn't quite how they expected. The welcome which they thought they would receive going to what they'd been taught perhaps in schools was the mother country. When they arrive, of course, they find that, for example, people won't actually give them somewhere to actually live because the landlords are racist. And as the speaker in the first clip said, not just against people from the Caribbean, but also against certain types of white people like Irish people.
Oh, thanks, Richard. I think that leads very well onto the second extract, and then I'll perhaps ask Patrick to say something about that. This is the same person talking about his first night in Wolverhampton. Thanks, Claire.
First night I came up to Wolverhampton, I had a few friends up at a place called Langley Road in Maryhill here. I went there, I thought they could put me up, but after they gave me a light meal, the manager came around and said, well, he can eat, but he can't sleep here. Just imagine, I'm a total stranger. So the men took me to another place and I got put up the night. And so we wouldn't have done that to an English person if he comes to Jamaica. We would leave our bed to give him.
Now, Patrick, what's your reaction to that comment? It seems he was completely dismayed by what he was coming to.
Well, I think it's very similar to what you've heard about this. People thought that by coming to Britain, because they were British, they would be treated equally and fairly, and that wasn't the case. It happened in accommodation, happened in social circumstances, hotels. The colour bar, this was about this, he was experiencing, articulating the colour bar around the discrimination a lot of people faced. That was my parents' experiences when they came to Britain from Jamaica, also in the late 1950s. I'm not quite sure if he served in the Second World War, but a lot of them served in the Second World War. And so when they came back to Britain, serving for king and country, they were disappointed. There were, many of them. I mean, the Windrush generation, they were the youngest and the most talented and the most educated when they came over here. It's like a brain drain from the Caribbean, and they were never utilised properly or valued properly when they came over here in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And then to make matters worse, some of them got caught up in the Windrush scandal as well.
I think we'll come up to that a bit later, Patrick, but it does puzzle me, this hostility for people coming to Britain. People who'd fought with the Allies, people from the Empire, as it was then, they'd fought with the Allies, and now they're being asked to come and help out. So where's the roots of this hostility and racism?
You can look at the history of empire, colonisation, the history of enslavement. I mean, after the First World War, there were race riots in Cardiff and Liverpool, because when men came back from the First World War and they saw black seamen particularly having their jobs and even having their partners, that led to a major rioting, basically. In the 1950s, there was a series of riots. You had the Notting Hill uprisings, where murder of Kelso Cochrane, also Nottingham as well. And I think I was told in Wolverhampton there were many disturbances and race riots also, where the resentment was pretty high in many ways. And and I think two things didn't happen. The government at the time did not explain properly to the public that we are inviting ex-servicemen and women and people from the colonies who are going to help and make a difference to this country in rebuilding the NHS, housing, construction, the manufacturing. It's a complete opposite, actually, in many ways. And I think the other reason also is, and not a lot of white people didn't, even though there's been a black presence in Britain going back to Roman times, this was the first time a lot of people came in a very en masse in a very short space of time. And sadly, that led to the rise of immigration controls and quotas, immigration legislation as well.
Okay. Richard, have you got any comments on that? I mean, I'm still puzzled. You mentioned the slave trade, and you mentioned the empire. Patrick mentioned that. And is that where the roots of this racism came then? The need to see the people that they're enslaving as not somehow as good as them. Is that where it comes from? No, it's either Richard or anyone can answer this.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. This year, everyone's been talking about Black Lives Matter.
Mm-hmm.
Black lives didn't matter for the Windrush generation, 50s and 60s, because essentially one of the impacts and legacies of empire and colonization were to treat black people, whether they came from Africa or the Caribbean, as less than equal, subhuman. So so basically they weren't given the level of respect and promotion opportunities. Again, the most talented people, some of them had middle-class background, and they were even more educated than the average white person, but they were treated and vilified, and their talent was suppressed in terms of their opportunities. And a lot of people were forced to do menial work, because those menial jobs that were those vacancies weren't white working class people didn't want to do those jobs, and so that's where people came from the Windrush generation and from Southeast Asia, and feel like that, which is no different today in terms of the kind of gig economy, the retail economy, where we were dependent on Eastern European labour. You know, so it's a cyclical nature of British history, basically.
Can I add to Patrick, if you don't mind?
Yeah, come on.
The quick one. Because, Patrick touched upon a number of things, but another area where Black people felt where they weren't felt welcome was in the churches as well. The first video you saw of Mr. Bishop Brown, he was one of the first pioneers with Mr. Garwood and Lysa. There were the three people that actually gone out of the way to establish Black churches because Black people were not felt welcome in the existing churches. And it's interesting because it gave Black people a place to go to and socialise. And they didn't expect that because coming from a Christianity background, they felt that Christians would accept them. So there's another level of racism going on from that angle.
That's very interesting. Should we have another clip now? This is actually a kind of detail about what people were facing in terms of keeping their accommodation. Okay.
So one of my friends was coming from work on the Sunday morning, and much to his surprise, there was a dog, feet in the air, and having a piddle on the bread. So he went in, when he got in, his first job was to filter the information to everybody. And he says, don't eat that bread this morning. There was a dog out there having a piddle on the bread. So everybody aware of that. So this lady went through her normal task of preparing the breakfast, butter the breads and everything. And when she realized about 10, 11 o'clock, the bread was still standing there. And so she called them together and said, well, what's happened to this bread? Everybody said, well, we don't feel like having any bread this morning. She said, okay. I said, well, I'll tell you a lot, Dan. If you don't eat that bread, by this evening, you got to find yourself somewhere to live. At that time, you couldn't find nowhere to live. And who has got a room accommodation is chock-a-block. So they finally decided they got to eat the bread. So you can imagine some of the look in their faces when they're going through the bread and it's turning up their nose. But eventually they had to eat the bread in order to maintain their accommodation. So that is something I never ever forgot. I always remember. And these are some of the hardships that we have to face.
Okay, so we'd like to comment on that one. It's sort of told in a quite humorous way, but it's actually a horrific story, isn't it? Patrick, does that fit with anything that you think your parents faced in that?
Well, it's interesting you talk about the whole stuff around humour, Frank, because obviously I think if you speak to anyone of my generation that was born, say, in Wolverhampton in the 60s, 70s, our parents didn't really talk about their experiences of discrimination. They actually didn't share that in the household. And I think one of the main reasons for that was just to protect us, you know, make it pure, make it pure that we could have a proper upbringing and just think of the possibilities of what we could do in our careers and schooling and stuff like, even though we did experience stuff, you know, but well, definitely my parents created an environment not to talk about that. It's only been in their twilight years when I talked to them and I've actually interviewed them that they told me all these little stories of microaggressions. I mean, we use the expression now, microaggression, and these were microaggressions that were used that happened to that generation, Windrush generation, but they shrugged it off. But there were consequences of that, because if you look at whole stuff around dementia, there's a lot of people in Windrush generation have a high proportion of dementia, and I think they've internalized that impact of racism in their body has an impact on their physical and mental health. Or maybe some people so traumatized they might have styled it and gave the impression of things were cool and stuff like that. But it's all internalized, and it's had a massive impact, you know. Whereas I think with the next generation, they didn't internalize it. They articulated that, and they got further even frustrated by that as well. So I think, but the humour thing is really important. It's part of Caribbean culture, folklore, and humour was used as a way of dealing with, especially going back to the history of enslavement in the Caribbean. People used to have parodies and almost have jokes against plantation owners on the overseers. That was their way of their coping mechanisms, as well as obvious stuff around fleeing and rebellion and suicide even.
Right, and the next extract we're going to have a look at is about education and discrimination in education. So let's have a look at that and then see what comments we can bring out of that.
I say especially my daughter, she went to all white girls grammar school, and I had to do what a mother had to do to protect my daughter, in the sense that I had to speak out for her. I never went to the teachers because they used to write notes and call her black pig and gollywog and why don't you go swing in the trees? And I realized she was being withdrawn. When she came from school, she always ran upstairs to her room. I said, what are you going upstairs for? She said, I just want to do some writing, Mum. And one day I went into the room and there was this piles of notes. And I thought, well, I says, I'll see these children. I said, go see the teacher. She says, no, Mum, because if you saw the teacher, it'll make it worse for me. I said, well, Pippi, I have to do something about it. I just can't let you suffer like this. So I says, okay, then I shan't do anything. But like a good old mother, I asked her the name of the children and she told me. And I went down there to the school about 8:30 in the morning. And I asked the other kids, I said, do you know so-and-so? And so I said, yes. So I said, point her out to me when she came. And I got all them together. And I says, I'm Pauline's mum. And I said, you've been calling her names and telling she's a gollywog and this. I says, why are you doing this? They said, we don't like her because she's the only black one in the school. So I says, okay. I says, this is your blouse because they're wearing nice navy and white. I said, this blouse is white, isn't it? She says, yes. I says, what's the color of your skin? She says, pinky, sort of a pink. I says, okay. I said, have you got a cat at home? She said, yes. I said, you got a dog? She says, yes. I said, when you go home, you take your hand and you pull away the hair of the dog's skin and the cat, and that's the color of your skin. I says, you say her hair is woolly like a gollywog. I says, have you seen the horse's hair? She says, yes, the tail. I says, that's what your hair is like. And I said, you see, she's got a nose, a big flat black nose. I said, have you seen the foul beak? She says, yes. I said, that's what your nose is like. But in a sense, you know, people might say I was racist in doing that to children. But I did that to make people realize, you know, you can always find something about someone that will make them feel bad. You know, and I've always taught my children to be very proud of their color. You know, it can be diluted, but it can't be taken away. You know, I said, her hair, which you say is woolly, I said, it's like the sheep's hair. I said, you feel mine. And you know, when Pauline had her 21st birthday, 2 of the girls came. I said, Mrs. Bennett, I thank you very much for that lesson you gave us because we've taught our children the same.
Well, Delva, does that ring up any bells with you about?
Well, I didn't go to grammar school, of course, but I know with my own brothers and sisters, they experienced being called names by teachers as well. Insofar as myself, they didn't consider me capable of taking O and A levels. So there were always barriers and ways in which they discriminated against Black people. And they told my parents not to interfere with educating us because my dad was very good at maths in Jamaica. And he came over here and they didn't want him to interfere. So there's a lot of issues, and I can understand what Maureen is saying, because it's not just about name calling, it's about their perception about whether you're capable in your ability to do just as well. I was told many a times I couldn't do O levels, and I stayed in sixth form for 1 year. I thought I passed my O-levels, but I didn't do so well. Went to college part-time, night classes, and came out with 5 O-levels, more than I did at school. So it's about the system itself, how it makes you feel you're not capable. So there are a lot of issues in schools when I was around, and I'm sure there are some still issues with some schools.
Thanks. So maybe Richard, when did things start to improve, or when did people realise they had to do something about this in historical context?
I think it was relatively recently. I mean, these issues existed, I would guess, probably well into the 1980s, if not the 1990s. And as the second generation started to be much more assertive and not turning the other cheek, as we've heard earlier, this basically forced the sort of central government and the local authorities as well to start realizing that the current situation wasn't acceptable.
Delva, do you think, though, in some ways, Wolverhampton was a bit of a pioneer in this field? I mean, I was told that the Race Equality Council in Wolverhampton was the first one in the country. Is that?
I mean, that's my understanding. What I picked up as well, talking to Black people, because we talk about the second generations in the 80s, but I must admit there were some generations who came over in the 50s. They experienced issues to do with work. And even in the 70s, they had to find somewhere to go to because they had housing problems, education problems, employment issues. So because of that, they raised their concern with the Wolverhampton Council. And out of that, we saw the establishment of Wolverhampton Race Equality Council. They were there.
What date was that?
And work with the council on the issues that people were encountering. So in a sense, to me, they were pioneering in the terms of the fact they established a body, organisation, where Black people could go to and keep in touch with the council to address issues in terms of housing, education, etc. So that was unique within itself.
And then there was the cultural centre as well, wasn't there?
There's the cultural centre as well, a place where people went to socialise, because they found that many times when they went to places like pubs or clubs or whatever to socialise, there's Black people weren't felt welcome. So the uniqueness out of that as well, we saw the development of the cultural centre.
So, and we were talking about a period late 50s, early 60s then for the
I think
establishment.
the cultural centre came around in the 70s, to be honest with you.
Right, okay. So after the, I think maybe Patrick might touch on this, the Enoch Powell's infamous speech, it was 69, wasn't it?
Yeah, 68, yeah, March 68.
And the effect of that, do you think that's as a setback to race relations?
Well, it did actually, because funny thing about Enoch Powell, I mean, he was an MP in Wolverhampton for many years. He spent most of his time in central London. He only came up to Wolverhampton, you know, maybe about 6 weeks of the year.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's different now. Now there's an expectation for your MP to live in or to, you know, be in the vicinity where the constituents are. But MPs in the 50s and 60s, even the 70s, they didn't go to their constituencies. They were all in central London. So it's really funny that Enoch Powell based a speech called Rivers of Blood when he's hardly in Wolverhampton. He was in central. He was in Belgravia. That's where he lived. Based on probably feedback he got from various people, and what's quite clear when we now know that one of the reasons why he did the speech was because that was his way of challenging Edward Heath as a potential Conservative leader.
Yeah.
Let's be clear about that. And this happens time and time again when politicians use hate and racism for their own political ends. It happened even today in 2020.
Yeah.
So he's no different to that. But his speech had an impact because all the research that's been done over the years, and Sharon Hurst, who wrote a book about his speech that came out about 18 months ago now, found there was an increase in hate crime targeting Black and Asian people in Wolverhampton and Black country. It gave almost like the permission of the far right, and I'm sure that influenced the whole creation of the National Front, and right up to Tommy Robinson. If you do a search on the Enoch Powell speech today, his speech is on lots of far right fascist organisations across Europe and in North America, basically. And but one of the consequences of there are three consequences of his speech. Firstly, obviously, the whole stuff around immigration. He made reference that that Britain would be mad to accept dependent children coming over here, and he was actually describing the late Paulette Wilson, who died, as you know, recently from Wolverhampton. She came to Wolverhampton as a 10-year-old. In the same year, ironically, when he did his speech, and then 50 years later, she got caught up in the Windrush scandal. So his speech, in many ways, laid the foundations or the genealogy of the hostile environment policy, which is still in force today. The second thing about the speech, which not many people know about, and touches on the whole stuff around education, was even though I wasn't the first person to talk about this, but he further reinforced it in his speech. He made references and he described children, immigrant children, i.e. someone like myself who was born in Wolverhampton, and many of us were born in Wolverhampton or came over as children, and we were classed this label, immigrant children. And he said that immigrant children would bring down the educational standards of white children in classrooms. And this actually had an impact and influenced Wolverhampton Council and the Education Authority. And I didn't know this until actually, again, when Sharon Hurst did her research work and she interviewed me. And the penny dropped for me about 40 years later, that a number of us were bussed around different schools in Wolverhampton because the council did not want to have too many Black and Asian children in the classrooms because of fear of white flight. And ironically, the junior school I went to eventually, Grove Junior School, which was opened in 1968, but right in the autumn of 1968, that school was built in 4 months because there was a massive baby boom, as you know, in the 60s, and there weren't enough educational places and schools, so they had to build this school in 4 months, Grove Junior School, which still stands today. Obviously, they've updated the building now, but it was prefabs in record time. I mean, can you build a school now in 4 months? No, seriously, how long will it take to build a school? 2 years, 3 years? This was done in 4 months. Yeah, and 70% of the children of that school, my primary school I went to, were Black and Asian. So ironically, even though we were bussed around Wolverhampton, they couldn't bus around us any longer because we're a larger number. When the school was officially opened, the mayor of Wolverhampton was there. Really short, the MP for Wolverhampton refused to attend the opening of the school because Enoch Powell was also invited as a guest, basically. And if you look at the archives, and I went to school about 2 years ago because we were invited as part of the 50th anniversary of Enoch Powell's speech, myself and ex-school teachers, which I'm still in contact with, by the way. And actually, one of my primary school teachers actually came to my graduation when I was given the honorary PhD at Wolverhampton University, as long as my secondary school teacher from Colton Hills. That's the collection I still have with them. And we were all got together, looked at old pictures and stuff like that. But but the consequence of Enoch Powell's speech, and I'm sorry going on about this, is a lot of my peers were classed as educational subnormal, and they were thwarted, not given the opportunities to get qualifications, and not, some of them had no qualifications when they left school because they were classed as educational subnormal. And I blame Enoch Powell to that, the way the policy had that fear in the educational authorities. I know it sounds a bit heavy now talking about it, but on reflection, it had a massive impact. Streaming, school streaming, and Black and Asian children, my peers, people, I was lucky, I got out of that. I did go to do college, like with Delva, to do more O levels, more A levels, then go to university. But a vast majority of people, some of them did okay. They got decent apprenticeships before we had the, obviously the meltdown in the 80s with mass unemployment. But a lot of them didn't achieve their full potential.
Okay.
I'm just angry with that.
Yeah, I'm just going to interrupt a little bit there, because if there's anyone who's watching this who wants to make any comments or ask any questions, just feel free to do it now. I think there are a few people online. I can't get the thing up at the moment. I'm just going to show one little extract about what you might call everyday racism before we kind of perhaps move on to some other aspects of it. So can we have extract 5, please?
As Black people wasn't much accepted in the community, see, because and at one occasion I went into a pub to have a drink, and while I was standing at the bar, minding my own business, just having my drink, I was approached by a white man, ready to fight me. See, I'm looking at his missus, of which I don't know his missus, I don't know. See, I was just having a quiet drink. And then another one come up and say, but he's not doing anything, he's only having a drink, leave him alone. And then, you know, and I just make case, drink up my drink and went.
So another slightly chilling story, I think, of what happened to people in their daily lives. I wonder if we can broaden it out about these interviews. What do we think we can learn from these interviews? Richard, maybe.
I think it's very important that we have this resource, because these are interviews with ordinary people. So we're getting the reflections of ordinary people as opposed to famous people.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think in Britain we've done that much in terms of collecting oral histories in comparison with some of the work they've done in the United States collecting oral history. And so this is a relatively unique resource we have in Wolverhampton. I doubt there are many towns or cities that have anything comparable to what we have in this collection.
What do you think about them? I mean, you've been involved with it from the beginning now, so.
Sorry, did you talking to me, Frank?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, sorry. I agree with what Richard said, but for me, the videos, it's not just the clippings we've seen, but if people go onto the YouTube and see all the other interviews, what's remarkable about it is the resilience.
Right.
Those people, they would not give in. There was one guy talking about, you know, bread being left on the door. But if you listen to his video, he goes on to say that there are a lot of Black people complaining about the hygiene of things. And because Black people raised concern, then they started to wrap bread in greaseproof paper. So Black people do feel that they've contributed to raising the issue about hygiene and not leaving your bread on your doorstep. So it's very educational, it really is. You talk about education. There's a lady that was interviewed, and hopefully she's on YouTube, called Mrs. Witter. She was the first Black woman in Wolverhampton who established the Saturday schools because she saw the impact that education was having on Black kids who were excluded, but also bussed out far, coming back, and the teachers weren't giving them the actual attention like other kids. So she invested her time on Saturdays to educate people. Out of that, we saw the second generation picking up on that work, where like we had the Saturday Steve Biko schools. So to me, yes, there were issues, but it's about the resilience of Black people, not giving up and keep fighting. So, yes, there's a lot to learn from it.
Yeah, I think resilience comes out time and time again. Patrick, have you got a comment on what we can learn from these interviews?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of there's a whole range of interviews, and obviously there are similar interviews in different parts of the country. Like in Lambeth, Lambeth got quite a few interviews with the Windrush Generation. In Hackney, I've been involved in some of the projects there in East London. And so there's quite a few of these. I mean, what needs to happen is all these interviews at some stage need to come together as a national depository of the history of the Windrush Generation. Wow. So unless you know about the stuff in Wolverhampton, and it'd be quite good to share those different experiences. That's the first thing. And in those interviews, despite all, people spend a lot of time talking about the challenges they face, and some of those challenges haven't fundamentally shifted in the last 50, 60 years, to be quite honest. But at the same time, there is that resilience, as Delva talks about. The Black Church movement, the first Black-led church that was established in Britain was in Wolverhampton in 1953, the New Testament Church of God, and that's history. If you look at the talent, the Black talent of the particularly second and third generation, I've done my campaign 100 Great Black Britons. I've got a book out, 100 Great Black Britons, and if you look at the talent of in business, sports, in local government, in terms of not just politics but senior management, a lot of people have come from the Wolverhampton area and gone on, and sadly, brain drain, left Wolverhampton and gone to other parts of the country or even internationally. So the second generation has done quite a lot. And when I come to Wolverhampton to see my parents and see friends, if you walk around Wolverhampton, you don't see that contribution. You don't see there's only one blue plaque, and that was because I got involved working with the Wolverhampton Civic Society and the New Testament Church of God and the Lifetime family, had that blue plaque at Heathtown Church. But apart from that blue plaque, there's nothing of apart from the Heritage Centre, and we've got Black churches. There is nothing that the council has done to commemorate in partnership the history of Windrush Generation. If you remove the hospitals would have come to a complete halt, the buses would have come to a complete halt, the factories would have come to a complete halt, and the dairy, all those places, good years would have come to a complete halt if it wasn't for our contribution. And that's not being properly acknowledged. It'd be fantastic if there was a book to highlight some, include some oral histories, a comprehensive book. When I go to Waterstones in Wolverhampton, and you look at local history in Wolverhampton, there's more books about yam-yams, and nothing wrong about yam-yams. We're all yam-yams, aren't we? Like, there's lots of books about history of Wolves Football Club. There's lots of local history books, and if you're lucky, you might even see an odd picture of a Black and Asian person in one of those local history books, if you're lucky.
Yeah.
So this resource is really important, and if we can make that into a publication, use it in schools, educate young people, Black and white, and about Windrush Generation. That's what's missing.
Totally agree with Patrick.
That's an excellent suggestion, Patrick.
Yes, it's a good suggestion. So I was just going to play another one, which is about pay discrimination at work, and then perhaps move on to other topics. But it's quite interesting because the person here sort of overcomes it for herself.
You know, one of the things when we were growing up, my mother used to say, wherever you go, live right with people. And I'm not saying that the prejudice is not there, but they don't show it to me. So I don't build on it. But I know there is prejudice. Yeah. One of the things that I know the prejudice is, if you're a white person working on the same job, you wouldn't get the same amount of money. They would give you less. And one day, we were working on this job and somebody said what they got. No, I'm not interested to know what the other person got. But I said, she don't work as hard as me. How is it she get more? And I sneak in the office and I ask, what's going on? Sometimes it's good to open your mouth. And he said, because they're doing higher rates. So I said, why, how is it they're getting higher rates than me and we're doing the same thing? Because I wasn't trained to do machine work. And afterward, it turns around that whatever job they gave me, they would say to me, don't let nobody see your payslip. So, at that point, it pays for me. So I can't say, that I had a bad time with white people.
Well, what do you make of that? Anyway,
To me, it's interesting from listening to the woman talk, but I do know that it still does exist in terms of difference in payment. I mean, I've listened to many of black people who've ended up being consultants, and when we sit and talk, they give example how a white consultant is paid more than them just to do a project in an organization. So there are issues there. You'll even find that in terms of if you're a manager and so on, yes, we're getting more black people being visible, but in terms of management position, but they still got a long way to go. But it's about the payment as well. And how do you justify the difference as well? Some do well, some don't. But to me, it's still an ongoing issue.
Right. Someone's made a comment on the Q&A. So someone anonymously says, I agree, this is a valuable resource. Oh, just a minute, it's gone. A valuable resource. And there should be a book to commemorate the contribution of black people in Wolverhampton. We hold ourselves up as a proud multicultural region, but we don't shout about it loud enough to promote that contribution. It's not enough to have 1 month of black history. And Richard says he'll follow up that suggestion. That would be a good thing for the university to get involved with. I mean, Sharon, that wrote the book that Patrick referred to, was a colleague of yours for a time.
That's right, yes. But sadly, she's moved on to another university.
Right, yes. Is there a way that the university could apply for money or something to do with a project like that, to look at these?
There are certainly funding councils that fund projects such as this. I think
when they're all online, it'll be much easier for people to research the interviews than it has been when they're just in the archive. So I think that's going to be something.
I mean, one of the things we thought about is, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had transcripts, written transcripts?
It would be, yes. Patrick, you referred to the contribution that this generation has made and the subsequent generations, and the need to sort of to mark it. And you said about having plaques and so on. there any other thoughts on how that could be done? Would this publication be another way to do it?
Yeah, I think yeah, transcripts would be good, because that might be used for performance, for drama, and maybe spoken word stuff. But I think if you could pull some of the elements into, I mean, behind me, if I can find it, there's a book. There it is. This book came out about 2 years ago. It's called Black Country Roots, and it's written about the story of the African Caribbean community, mainly focused in West Bromwich and Sandwell.
Right.
About the contribution. Why can't we have a book like this, Wolverhampton?
Yeah.
Perhaps do some more. Perhaps need to update and get some more interviews, because you know. But I think it'd be good to get some funding, build on the project you, Frank, and others have been involved in. Delva's been involved in as well, and make it into a publication. And every copy goes to every single school, every single library, care homes, nursing homes, etc.
That'd be good. Just a thought, I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, but the interviews are like 20 years old now. So in a sense, they're now part of the history. And I'd like to ask about how things have changed since then. You know, have things changed for the better or worse, or what nuances around that? I don't know, Patrick.
What has changed? Obviously, there has been some change. You know,
I'm thinking of the perception that their stories they were telling was, we're obviously looking back up to 50 years before. And obviously we can't interview those people again. A lot of them sadly may have died since then. But what as a perspective on that time has changed, do you think?
No, I mean, you know, there's still members of the Windrush generation still alive today, who have got very good long-term memories, and they can, you know, like even speak to my dad, he can remember, you know, coming to Wolverhampton, him and 14 guys sharing a house down Penfields, and having a shift system, and he can, and you know, remember those stories. I mean, so maybe there should be a phase 2 or Mark 2, and capture some more stories. So you've got the ones that you did 15, 20 years ago, which are relevant, and that could be updated, and maybe actually have interviews of the first generation, my generation actually, who were born here or came here as children, to supplement those other stories. Because now, you know, my age, where we've got children and we've got grandchildren, so, you know.
Yeah, I totally agree with Patrick there, Frank. It would be good if we could actually take it a bit further, because some of the issues that the people talked about in the first lot of videos, like say like education, they still relate to a lot of issues that some kids are going through in terms of exams, teachers thinking whether they're capable of taking O-level, A-level. But even if when they do well, go on to university, there's the issue about jobs. Why don't we see a lot of Black people in management? We've made a bit of progress, but it's still a working issue. We still got to keep pushing it. And it rings loud and clear in today's society with the younger generation. Black Lives Matters, they raise a lot of issues about equality and fairness. So it'd be interesting to see how some of those first lot of people who got involved in the interviews, what their kids are saying in comparison to their parents. And it needs to be ongoing, because this stuff needs to be put in schools, not just university. You know, the schools got to play a greater part. But there again, the government have a lot of issues about that, because I hear that they are a bit like not wanting to teach Black History Month in schools. So that's another issue within itself. But we've got to make the lead in Wolverhampton and get schools on board and say, here's a wealth of information. You could start planning for your curriculum to teach your kids in terms of the contributions, past and present generation.
I mean, there have been several things recently which we've touched on. There's obviously the Windrush scandal, which Patrick had a big part to play in raising that, and also Black Lives Matter, which you mentioned, Delva. So at the time when the interviews were made, was it, you think, a more optimistic time in terms of how things were progressing?
Sorry, I missed that question there.
Was it a more optimistic time, do you think, when the interviews were made those 20 years ago than it is now?
For me, being involved in the project itself, the BME project, the Black people there got involved, were optimistic, but they knew it was a challenge. You know, things wouldn't change overnight, but they felt that without actually fighting for changes, things wouldn't happen. So they expected better for their generation, their kids, and so on and so forth. So they had this optimism about their kids doing better than them and progressing.
Yeah. Okay. I hate to mention it, but the funding for this project has actually come from what's called the Windrush Day Fund, and it's come from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. I wonder, Patrick, have you any thoughts on that?
Well, the fund came about because the governments have earmarked for the last 2 years now £500,000 to support the commemoration of Windrush Day. And I was kind of campaigning, apart from a campaign for the Windrush scandal, I've been campaigning for National Windrush Day. I mean, the idea of Windrush Day was actually the concept of Windrush Day came up, was the Windrush Foundation, Sam King, who was in the Windrush ship. So they organised events for many years celebrating Windrush Day. But I decided that should be, I actually campaigned for a public holiday about 11 years ago. That was my, but then I was told not going to get a public holiday because there's a whole queue of other public holidays that people want. So I campaigned for National Windrush Day, worked with a whole range of celebrities, people, had letters in the Times, petitions, early day motions in Parliament. And it wasn't until we had a scandal, the Windrush scandal in 2018, that Theresa May agreed to Windrush Day. And you can make your own interpretations of why she agreed to it. But we've got it. And I think the key thing is how we use it. I'm a bit disappointed that the money that's been given out each year, £500,000, is not serious enough. I think there should be at least £1 million, £2 million, proper money to do stuff, to build, like, for example, funding stuff like, capture more oral histories. I mean, I know you can apply to the National Heritage Lottery Fund for projects around heritage, and that's fine, but there should be money also should be used focusing on the Windrush contribution, intergenerational learning. But the Windrush Day is not so much about the day, it's about using the day as a platform for other stuff. So, for example, the Windrush contribution is not fully embedded in the national curriculum. Young people will learn more about the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks, than Paul Stevenson, who led the Bristol boycott in 1963. David Ashworth, who took British Rail to court in 1965 because there was just a colour bar at Hughes Station. Leary Constantine in 1944, ironically, during the Second World War, went to High Court, won a case into colour bar because he refused to have a room in the Imperial Hotel in central London. You can go far back, Harold Moody and the work he was doing in Britain in the 1930s. You can go far back as Robert Wedderburn. You can go far back as so basically we should be teaching more about Black British history, and that's one of the reasons why I've done my book. I'm allowed to do it.
What's your book?
100 Great Black Britons, in all good bookshops. And I'll be doing a talk about that at the university next week. It's so the Windrush Day is great. The money's not enough, and I think we need more work to do to recognise. And I think in Wolverhampton, you know, I know that they've organised Windrush Day events. I can remember last year, sadly, Wolverhampton Council, the Art Gallery organised a Windrush Day event, which I showed my documentary I made about Edna Martin Noble, serving the Second World War. Paulette Wilson was there as my guest with her daughter Natalie, along with the local MPs, celebrating and commemorating Windrush Day, but at the same time recognising that there's still injustice for the Windrush generation. We can't completely. I use the expression, it's bittersweet. It's bitter because we still need justice for the Windrush generation, but at the same time, we still have to acknowledge the contribution of the Windrush generation in Wolverhampton, the Black Country, and nationally.
Oh, thanks, Patrick. No, we've been going for just over an hour. So is there any final comments that anyone would like to make before we hand back to Claire? Right, okay, well, thank you, Richard, Patrick, and Delva for your contributions. Hope it hasn't been too difficult. And I'll hand you back to Claire, and thank you very much for allowing us to have this platform, Claire.
You're most welcome. I think, you know, it's been a really interesting discussion, and I think it's certainly one that could continue past this hour for sure. Thank you all for coming. Delva, Richard, Patrick, and Frank for hosting and holding it all together. Please do go and see the exhibition at Wolverhampton Art Gallery if you haven't already. And if you've missed any of the talks today, we will be uploading them to YouTube over the coming days, so they will be available to watch shortly. Our next event will be on Tuesday, the 27th of October, with Patrick Vernon, as he said, talking about his book, 100 Greatest Black Britons. You can book this through Eventbrite, and thanks for watching. Enjoy the rest of your evening. See you all soon.
Right, thank you very much.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.